Okay, so now let us talk about what is the reason. Can we really find a theory that leads to this inverse relationship between the price index and the aggregate demand, or this inverse relationship between the price index and the total expenditure? Well, there is an answer to it, and the answer is given by Pigou wealth effect. So Pigou is the name of the economist, and the theory is called wealth effect. Okay, and additionally some people also talk about another reason, which is called the real balance effect. So these two are responsible for this inverse relationship. Okay, so basically these two effects, these are the two things that are explaining the downward slope of the AD curve. These explain the downward slope of AD curve, or the inverse relationship between the price index and AD. Okay, so let us understand what is the Pigou wealth effect. Okay, the Pigou wealth effect basically says that if there is inflation in the economy, that means if the price index in the economy goes up, then the value of your wealth, the value of your assets would be going down, and as a result of that you will have lesser expenditure and you will have lesser aggregate demand at the macro level. In other words, what I am trying to say, let's say you have a big house and you have some stocks of a company. So these are your assets. You have some housing wealth, the house is your housing wealth, and you have the stocks of a company which is your non-housing wealth, right? So you have this volume of wealth. If the total price if the average price in the economy goes up, that means if there is inflation in the economy, then actually the valuation of this house and the valuation of these stocks go down. The valuation goes down because now your house is worth less money. How is that true? You know, the valuation may remain the same. Your house may be still worth $100,000, but how much can you buy with that $100,000? That has gone down because your economy has become expensive. Maybe yesterday when the economy was cheaper, you could sell the house for $100,000, and with those $100,000 maybe you can buy 100 diamond necklaces, right? But today your economy has become relatively more expensive due to inflation. So that same $100,000 which you can get from your house by selling your house, maybe today it can buy you only 50 diamond necklaces. So the worth of your house goes down whenever there is a situation of rising prices or inflation in the economy. In other words, the value of your wealth decreases with inflation and the value of your wealth increases with deflation, and as a result of that you see that inverse relationship. So that is the Pigou wealth effect. The wealth effect says that inflation leads to a decrease in the value of your wealth and deflation leads to an increase in the value of your wealth, and that leads to the inverse relationship between the price index and the aggregate demand for the economy, and that's one reason for the downward slope of the AD curve. The other explanation which is given by some economists is called the real balance effect, where the real balance effect basically refers to the purchasing power of the money, the purchasing power of your currency that you have in your pocket, the dollar bill basically, right? So let's say today I walk into Big Mac and I have a $10 bill in my pocket, right? And I walk into McDonald's and I ask for Big Mac and they tell me that Big Mac is worth $2 each. So the $10 that I have in my pocket is able to buy me 5 Big Macs, isn't it? $2 each, so I can buy 5 Big Macs. Tomorrow, if inflation happens in my economy and everything in the economy becomes expensive in general, then that same $10 bill in my pocket, it will now be able to get me less number of Big Macs. Maybe I walk into the same McDonald's and they tell me that today the Big Mac is $5 each because there has been inflation in the economy. So that means now that same $10 can buy me only 2 Big Macs. Isn't it? In other words, the real value of the $10, of the same $10 has gone down, or the purchasing power of the same $10 has gone down. So everything else in the economy is staying the same, with no change in the number of currency bills, with no change in the amount of money in the economy. Due to this real balance effect, if there is inflation, then people will be demanding a smaller basket of goods and services because the money in their pocket has not changed. Yesterday they could buy 5 Big Macs, demand 5 Big Macs. Today they have to demand 2 Big Macs because the money in the pocket has not changed. That is what we mean by the real balance effect. If there is inflation, then the real purchasing power of money goes down. If there is deflation, then the real purchasing power of money goes up. And as a result of that, you see this inverse relationship, and that inverse relationship is reflected in the downward slope of the AD curve. Now please note that these are all talking about situations, these are all talking about by these I mean the wealth effect and the real balance effect. They are talking about a relationship between the price index and the aggregate demand. So they are talking about the relationship between aggregate demand and the variable that is measured in the y-axis. So these are basically talking about the movements along the aggregate demand curve, because what is changing is the variable in the y-axis, the price index, right? So these two are really talking about the movements of the aggregate demand curve, the movements along the same aggregate demand curve. These are not talking about the shifts. Next, let us talk about the aggregate demand shifters. What are the factors that could shift the aggregate demand curve? The AD shifters. Now under the AD shifters we have some effects. The first one and the most important one is called the interest rate effect. Okay, the second one is foreign income effect. The third one is consumer expectations. And the last one is government policies, the macroeconomic policies of the government. Okay. So these are the factors that could actually lead to a shift of the aggregate demand curve either to a right or to the left. That means we are talking about these effects could really increase or decrease aggregate demand. That means change aggregate demand with constant price index capital P. That means with no change on the y-axis, with no inflation or deflation happening in the economy, these effects are responsible for either increasing the aggregate demand or decreasing the aggregate demand, as a result of which the aggregate demand would either shift to the right or it would shift to the left. Now please remember, these effects are talking about the movements along the AD curve, and these effects are all talking about the shifts of the AD curve. These effects are talking about inflation or deflation, and as a result of that the aggregate demand changing. These are all talking about something else changing, which leads to either an increase in AD or decrease in AD, but no inflation or deflation happening in the economy. The price index is constant. That means your y-axis is constant. So in the next video, let's talk about these effects in detail, and then we are going to move on to the aggregate supply side.